They cried out with a loud voice, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? How long? Uh, this is borrowed from the Psalms when people are lamenting and they cry out, how long? And it's interesting that we find this here because, from the human perspective, it seems to be taking a long time. The martyrs feel like the second coming is too delayed and they wish it would hurry up. Now, this is important for a very controversial conversation on what did the early Christians believe about the second coming of Jesus. And if you haven't encountered this, one day you will. And if you read a lot of biblical literature, especially in terms of interfacing with the unbelieving world, you'll meet this argument a lot, which says early Christians believed Jesus would come back in their day and were scandalized when he didn't. Now, alternatively to this, I'm going to say the correct characterization works like this. Early Christians thought Jesus could come back in their time, and various circumstances sometimes made it seem almost certain that he would, but they still maintained that he could possibly take a long time. In other words, the first generation of Christians thought this was ambiguous and they thought it was a mystery, and they kept both options on the table. And that's why when we do a full sweep of the data, we find very excited moments where they think Jesus could come back very quickly, and then other places where they talk a different way. They simply allowed this to be open. They were not dogmatic that it necessarily had to happen very quickly. And so uh, let's think about this from the point of view of the book of Revelation. There are many passages in Revelation that say it's going to happen soon. And skeptics will seize upon these passages sometimes and say, well, what is the deal with Revelation saying everything will happen so quickly? And then you get to this passage and they say, how long, right? It's that other option that is being entertained. And John seems to think that there are many martyrs, many Christian martyrs crying out. Well, that's interesting because at the time Revelation is written, there hasn't been that many Christian martyrs yet. So the book must necessarily be providing for some time that more Christian martyrs can come in. There's only one named martyr in the whole book, and that's Antipas, who died in Pergamum. We met him in chapter 2. The only group of martyrs by the time Revelation is written that we know about for sure are those who died under the persecutions of Nero in the city of Rome itself in about 64 AD. Otherwise, there have not been that many martyrs by time Revelation is written. And Revelation thinks that there's going to be a bunch of these guys before the end arrives. And so this is evidence that the writer is not dogmatically saying it's going to take place next week or something. He is saying additional things have to transpire. And we also want to remember that Revelation is very tricky in the way that it sees time. We found in earlier parts of the book, when it talks about the second coming happening quickly, that we examine that, and it's not the second coming at the end of the age. In other words, for John, Jesus comes back many times. There's a kind of a second coming that takes place within history. Anytime Christ shows up within history and relieves the church of their suffering and puts evildoers firmly in their place, this is discussed as being a kind of second coming. And this can happen many times until Jesus actually comes back at the end of the age. And one of our pieces of evidence for this, when we were back in chapter 3, we looked at Jesus' address to the church at Sardis, and what does he tell them? I will come like a thief, and you will not know at what hour I will come. This is stock language for the second coming. And yet, scholars have basically agreed when you look at the address to them, and also when you look at the address to the Ephesians, and second coming language is used, it's not talking about the culmination of history. It's talking about something that is going to take place there to them locally within history that is a picture of the second coming at the end of the age. And so again, when you see Revelation says these things will take place soon, you need to recognize that there are sort of these micro fulfillments of the second coming that take place within history, and that is what John is talking about. He's not saying that the second coming in its greatest expression is necessarily going to take place next month. Well, what about Paul? This is a place where people often go. And it is the case that he has a few excited moments where he seems to think that the second coming is very soon. One that people point to is in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where he says, "This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none," and so on and so forth. And he gives us a kind of a state of mind that some folks have caricatured as being a kind of apocalyptic panic. Well, it is the case that when he's writing to the church at Corinth, that it's a turbulent time, and there's the famine under Emperor Claudius, and people are suffering, and people might have noticed this and wondered if it's the sign of the times. But Paul is interesting because, one, when he starts this discourse in chapter 7, he says explicitly, this is not a command from the Lord. This is my own point of view. In other words, the Lord didn't tell Paul, yes, it's about to end, therefore tell people to live this way. Paul tells you, this is my own inference, this is my own judgment, and based on my perception that the time is growing short, this is how I think you should live. He does qualify that as not coming from the Lord, and that's very important. And yet he says in verse 36 that if a woman is moving past childbearing age, then she can marry and bear children. So he seems then to assume that there could be enough time to have children. He also makes big plans, such as in his letter to the Romans, he says he's going to go to Spain. Apparently he believes Spain will still be there when he arrives. And he makes travel plans that would seem to suggest he doesn't think that it's all going to end next week. For example, he stays at Corinth for a year and a half. Now, is that the traveling itinerary of someone who thinks it's going down in the next 3 or 4 months? He would probably get around a little bit faster and try to proclaim the word to more people if he necessarily believed in a doctrine of imminence that said Jesus could just show up at any second. Did Paul think that he would be alive when Jesus came back? Well, he certainly seems to consider that a possibility, but there are other times when, he simply says otherwise and doesn't seem to feel like he's changing his mind. He doesn't seem scandalized by any of this. For example, Paul is so excited about the second coming in 1 Corinthians, and then after 1 Corinthians is written, he goes to jail in Ephesus. And then he writes 2 Corinthians, and he has this other state of mind. He says, "We were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. But that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead." Between the composition of 1 and 2 Corinthians, it looks like Paul came to terms with the fact that he would die before Jesus comes back. And yet he doesn't seem to think this somehow means Jesus' promise to come back has failed. Paul clearly is open to the notion that it could take a while. And this is worth noting. When you talk to a Christian, and it's usually like the rapture people, when you talk to a Christian who has a doctrine of imminence that just says Jesus can just show up at any time and nothing has to be fulfilled before Jesus comes for his church, they'll point to passages where it says that Jesus comes like a thief in the night. It's interesting that Paul does not think that is for Christians, right? He thinks Jesus does not come for the church like a thief in the night, that he comes for unbelievers like a thief in the night. Because, of course, if someone is breaking into your house as a thief, that is a negative thing. It's not a positive thing. As he says in 1 Thessalonians 5, "For you yourselves are fully aware that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. But you are not in darkness, brothers, for that day to surprise you like a thief. For you are all children of light, children of the day. We are not of the night or of the darkness. Only the people in the dark," says Paul, "are those for whom the Lord comes like a thief in the night." And then finally, the last thing to look at with Paul, Paul must provide for some time before the return of Jesus, because he says Jesus can't come back until some things happen first. It's not the case that he can just show up at any second. He tells the Thessalonians not to be quickly shaken in mind or alarmed either by a spirit or a spoken word or a letter seeming to come from us, to the effect that the day of the Lord has come. Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction. So Paul says two things have to happen before the Lord Jesus comes back. First, the Antichrist has to be revealed, and two, there has to be a great apostasy, a great deception that causes people to leave the true church. And these two things are probably connected. It's probably the man of sin who precipitates this great apostasy. Now, this is the only place where Paul gives us a sequence of events that have to take place before Jesus comes back. And notice it's the opposite of what many of us have been taught. Many of us have been taught that Jesus comes and takes the church away for the rapture, and then for 7 years you have the Antichrist. But Paul says the Antichrist comes first, and the apostasy comes first. Then Jesus comes for his church. In the Gospels, Jesus is open to the possibility that it could take a while. We have sayings such as the one at the end of Matthew 24, where he says, a certain steward says, "My Lord is delayed. He's taking too long." And so he starts to do all these things he's not supposed to do. And then right after that, you get the parable of the 10 virgins. And 5 of them go out and they don't take enough oil in their lamp because they think Jesus is going to come sooner than he does. Jesus is quite open to the possibility that things could take a while. Now, the way skeptics will respond is they'll say that material in the Gospels where Jesus acts like it could take a while are things Jesus didn't really say, but rather after the first generation passed away and Jesus didn't come back, the early church made up those sayings of Jesus and then retrojected them back onto the lips of Jesus to make it look like Jesus was open to a long-term possibility, that it was a cover-up job for Jesus' failure. That's why this saying is so interesting to us, where Jesus says, "But concerning that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only." A skeptical approach to the sayings of Jesus often uses a method that is called form criticism. Now, form criticism is like what I just said, that some of these sayings attributed to Jesus do not go back to the historical Jesus, but rather Christians made these up and then put them on the lips of Jesus later. And the sayings are actually a reflection of those Christian communities. They're not things that the historical Jesus said. Well, there's all sorts of things wrong with that approach. A lot of things. That could be, its own entire lesson. But what's so fascinating is even these skeptics will say some of Jesus' sayings are authentic and go back to Jesus. And they have a series of tests and a series of criteria for establishing which sayings of Jesus are authentic. And the most trusted criterion that they use is called the criterion of embarrassment. And this simply says that any actions of Jesus and any sayings of Jesus that would have embarrassed the early church, Jesus likely said and did those things, because you're not going to make up traditions that embarrass you. So, for example, even skeptical scholars tend to think that the historical Jesus got baptized by John the Baptist. Well, why? Well, the criterion of embarrassment. The church certainly wouldn't make up a tradition where Jesus submits to another man's baptism, because usually it was the lesser who submitted to the baptism of the greater. If Jesus is submitting to somebody else's baptism, that's embarrassing. And so they say the church didn't make that up. The historical Jesus actually was baptized. Even the skeptics admit that. Well, one thing that Jesus is not going, one type of saying of Jesus that the church isn't going to invent because it would be embarrassing for their cause is any place where Jesus confesses ignorance. Here, Jesus plainly confesses that he is ignorant of the day or the hour. He doesn't know when the second coming is going to be. And therefore, even if you took a radically skeptical approach to the sayings of Jesus, this is one of the sayings of Jesus that you're going to have to, if you're consistent, you're going to have to say the historical Jesus actually said this. And so it is not the case that first century Christians, starting with Jesus, all thought the end would take place in their time, and then following generations invented Jesus traditions proposing delay. Jesus is ambiguous. He himself says he doesn't know, and he is certainly within the first generation. Paul writes earlier than the gospel writers. He is within the first generation. He entertains both possibilities. And it's interesting that in the second century, the church fathers don't know that there's a problem, right? They know that Jesus has not come back, and they don't seem to think that there's an issue or there's a cover-up job or we need to come up with excuses. They seem to be okay with it. So this notion that the early Christians were so disappointed when Jesus didn't come back in their day is an artificial construct that certain ill-intentioned skeptics have superimposed upon the data. The final thing I'll say about that is it reflects a naive belief in lack of diversity in linear progression. That's a mouthful, so what do I mean? Well, skeptics often tell us that we should not talk about Christianity, but Christianities, plural, that there were so many different Christianities in the early period, and that the notion that there was some orthodox singular Christianity is a Christian invention, but in fact, there was just all these people who disagreed with each other. They'll tell us the Gospel of John was written to destroy Petrine, Peter Christianity, the Synoptics, and that Revelation is written to attack the Apostle Paul, and that's how many of these guys will view the New Testament. It's representing different Christianities who are all competing with each other. And so they tell us to respect diversity of thought, and yet they think there was no diversity at all in the first generation, that somehow all these different Christianities believed exactly the same thing about Jesus coming back soon, and that they all get disappointed. Well, why is this the one place where they don't accept diversity of Christian thought? Because it's a power play that they use against Christianity, right? It's incredibly hypocritical. So for those of you watching online, I'm going to include in the description a link to one of N.T. Wright's lectures where he shows that this notion that so many of us have been conditioned to believe, that the early church believed Jesus was coming back in their time and were greatly disappointed when he didn't, that this in fact does not come from a reading of the Gospels. It certainly doesn't come from an investigation of Second Temple Judaism or the ancient church. This actually comes from German scholarship. It comes from Schweitzer. And Schweitzer gets it from his favorite music, Richard Wagner, who makes many, many operas about the end of the world. It's so fascinating that apocalyptic German thought infiltrated New Testament scholarship, and we've all been stuck with this idea ever since, told that it comes from the New Testament, when in fact it came from the Germans, who, as we know, were on their way to precipitating the bloodiest and most apocalyptic century in human history. So let's shift gears.